So I'm recording this today's session. So if you don't want to be in the video, please turn your camera off or rename yourself, whatever suits you. So hello everyone, I'm Victoria Sors and I'm a climate communicator and psychologist from the Climate Smart Elephant climate communication and coaching agency. And mostly I'm working with municipalities both on national and international levels. And my goal is to create effective communication campaigns and citizen engagement processes for them. And my goal with this webinar series is to show you new perspectives. I mean, it will come out that it's not so new actually, it's new, it's quite new for me. So new perspectives on climate communication and coaching. And I'm also trying to highlight links to psychology and research. And our topic today is strategies for improving lives, not just sustainability wise, but also health wise and otherwise as well. And today's big question is how to influence behaviors and deliver positive social change. And with founder and managing director Luke van der Beeke from Australia-based social enterprise, the Behaviour Change Collaborative, we are going to explore strategies and approaches for creating positive social change. And Luke is an internationally recognized expert in social marketing and behavior change communications with over 25 years of experience delivering change programs for governments, NGOs, and social businesses. So I think we can learn a lot today here. Thank you so much, Luke, for accepting this.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
It's a big pleasure. And before we start, just a quick overview. I prepared some questions, so we are going to start the discussion with Luke, but please feel free to post your questions in the chat. And also we are going to have a question and answer session later. We are going to start with a bit of an overview on what social marketing is. We will get some theory as well, and lots of experience from Luke. So please put your questions in the chat, and all comments, questions are welcome. So we already started discussing here with Luke. My first question would be, how does someone become a social marketeer? And what is your work really? We already started to talk about that this is an old kind of field, but I think it's quite unknown to many of us here today.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And as I said, it's good to be here. Hello, everyone. I think there's no simple answer to how one becomes a social marketer, to be quite honest with you. I think people come to the field from a variety of different paths. I personally, like you, Victoria, was a marketing and communications background originally. I worked a long time in NGOs and in health particularly, and then a bit of international development, and just fell into social marketing and have been doing it probably for about 12 or 13 years now. So there are a lot of marketing comms people, many from commercial backgrounds, who want to apply, I guess, the same tools and techniques they were using to sell big brands to solve social problems or environmental challenges, so on and so forth. So it appeals to those sort of individuals, and consequently, you do get a lot of people from those sort of comms backgrounds. But equally, we've got sociologists, we have psychologists, we have people from a range of different arenas who really, as I say, share the common goal of wanting to unpack real world challenges and do something positive with what are marketing tools and techniques.
Mm-hmm. So we are used to awareness raising campaigns and all kinds of communication campaigns. What is the main difference between these two approaches? Is one part of the other, or how should we think about this?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly communication campaigns are very much probably a part of a social marketing methods mix. So being marketing, obviously, we used to many years ago use the 4 Ps, but promotion is a key part of what it is we do to try and certainly create awareness of issues, or create, build education, understanding and knowledge. But it's not the entirety of what social marketing is. It tends to be the most visible aspect of what social marketers do. So we actually look at a range of other tools and strategies as well. And I think that's because we recognize in social marketing that individuals behave within a context and within, be that a social context, a regulatory or legislative context, so on and so forth. So we look to apply lots of different tools and strategies to address behavioural challenges. I used to work at the National Social Marketing Centre in the UK, and they always used to talk about social marketing being a planning process. And so absolutely, once you got to a point where you felt you had a good mix of options available, communications and campaigns and those sorts of approaches tended to be an important piece of the jigsaw. But equally, you know, there are a range of other things that we would look at in terms of, as I've said, policy and regulatory settings, what we might be able to do in terms of designing solutions, how we're presenting different choices, so on and so forth. So I would say, yeah, comms is an important part of social marketing, but it is very much a part of it and not social marketing in its entirety.
It seems to be quite a complex field then. And you have to know a lot of things in order to put this process in place.
You do. What I'd say though is I think what unites most social marketers in their thinking is that it is very much sort of customer orientated or audience orientated. So yes, there are people with expertise in different fields, and as I say, it's very much a multidisciplinary field. But as I've said to you, I'd consider myself very much a generalist. So, you know, I understand bits and pieces of lots of different things, but I don't consider myself to be an expert in much of anything, to be honest. I think the people that we're seeking to serve are. And I think with social marketing, it's very much a case of how we orientate what we're doing towards the people that we purport to serve. And that starts with problem definition and really working with communities, with target audiences to better understand what it is that we need to put together to address the particular challenge that we think is there. So, for example, I mean, one of the things that we would regularly come across, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners would know too, is that oftentimes when we're thinking about problems and defining problems at a sort of government level or organisational level, we will get some data, we'll mistake it for insight, and we'll work on the assumption that, you know, there is an issue, say, for example, smoking in youth. So the problem is there's too much smoking in youth. And then, of course, if you actually go and talk to youth, they'll be saying, well, that's actually really not a problem for us at all. But meanwhile, we've developed an entire comms campaign around that problem as we see it, and really only engage youth at the point that we start to test the messages. So in social marketing, what we want to be doing is orientating to target audiences right from the outset and being really clear about what's going on in their lives and how they're seeing and framing problems, and then developing interventions that address those rather than address what we think they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned before we started officially today's chat that the problem is that clients oftentimes don't call you before the start, so you have to step in the process a bit later. So how can you modify the trajectory then?
Yeah, I mean,
if something was already started and you have to fix it.
Yeah, it can be really challenging. I mean, I can't say, to be, you know, hand on heart that I have a really good answer to that. I mean, my solution at the Behaviour Change Collaborative has been to really beef up our research and so behavioural research so that we can try to get in before a lot of that work happens. So one of the issues that I did used to have, and I know many of my colleagues have as well, is that we would go to clients who would say, look, we've done the research, we know what the problems are, can you design a behaviour change program for us? And that was really challenging because, as I've said, oftentimes what you get in terms of research that's commissioned is a lot of really good data about what problems are. So, you know, in the realm of road safety, it's, you know, where people, what age groups people are seeing sort of traffic accidents in, where they're happening, so on and so forth, but not so much insight around what's actually going on and why people are making the choices they are at given points in time. So there's a difference between research and behavioural research. So yeah, as I say, my solution has been really to sort of bring that in and try and get in nice and early because it is really challenging, and we can work with what we're given to a point, but more often than not, I've said to prospective clients that we were not actually able to help. The best bet is going to be to do X, Y, or Z, and or commission us to do some research so that we can really understand what's moving and motivating people's behaviours.
So let's take the example that you used about smoking. How should we imagine behaviour research with adolescent smoking or young adult smoking?
Well, I should probably preface this by saying that I'm not a researcher. So I've got some very good researchers now on board at the Behaviour Change Collaborative, but it's certainly not a strength of mine. But as I say, I think really for us, it's about understanding what type of research is needed and really being clear about the behavioural problem that we're trying to unpick. So speaking in broad terms, I think what we tend to do, and this isn't just in smoking, this has been across a range of different sort of policy areas, is we sort of fall into the trap of thinking that, you know, if we know that something is wrong and we tell people that something is wrong, then they'll modify their behaviour. But of course, people aren't rational. And behavioural economics, which has sort of really been on the rise probably for the last almost 15 years now in sort of public policy settings, they're making, you know, real noise in and around that fact. So for us, it's about understanding, I think, what's actually going on in people's lives and how they're framing problems, in what context it is that they're, whether, you know, in the case of smoking, where they're smoking, who they're smoking with, who's influencing their decisions, so on and so forth. What might we be able to substitute that behaviour with? Understanding that it's a habit, I think, and indeed an addiction. I think with smoking, certainly in the early days, I think a mistake was made that we sort of treated it as a decision that was made and not treating it as an addiction like we would some other things. But that said, I think that's obviously corrected over time. And I think certainly in Australia, our success in public health and sort of combating smoking and youth smoking has been really, really strong. But again, back to your point, sort of early on in the piece, that I think is a function not just of some really good advertising campaigns, but I think it's because there has been a systems-based approach to tackling it. So we've been very strong from a regulatory standpoint in terms of plain packaging and hiding cigarettes away. We've been, you know, in terms of pricing strategies. So it's a very sort of cohesive, coordinated approach to tackling the problem, as opposed to just throwing an ad out there and thinking that that's going to do the job.
Yeah. So talking about smoking and other projects, so what kind of projects are you running with the Behaviour Change Collaborative? What kind of clients are you working with? How should we imagine your work?
Yeah, it's actually quite an eclectic mix of clients and projects, and that's one of the things I love. I mean, we're a really small social enterprise, to be quite honest with you. And the reason that I set it up is because I do like the variety of working across lots of different health areas, but also, as I've said, sort of road safety and climate. So in terms of current projects at the moment, we're just finishing off some work with the New Zealand Transport Authority. So we've been doing a strategic review of their road safety program. They're moving towards Road to Zero. So we're just providing support there and how they might adopt a more robust social marketing approach, which I might add, they already do exceptionally well. So it was really nice to sort of see the work that they've been done and try to augment, I think, the excellent work that they've done to date with just, you know, a few other tips and tools and techniques that they might consider. Doing some work with the Department of Transport, both research and again, a long-term social change strategy. We're doing work with Greening Australia, who's a fairly large non-profit organisation here, which is around urban heat. And really our lens is around the community engagement side to that. So rather than just planting trees in the ground because it's the right thing to do and it reduces urban heat spots and so on and so forth, it's actually how we use that process to activate communities, how we encourage people to, you know, getting them involved in planting activities in parks, but then getting that to actually act as a catalyst for what they're doing on their verges and in their home gardens. So that's very much a community-based social marketing type project. And we're also doing the evaluation on that. We're doing some work with alcohol and other drugs with young people, developing an alcohol action plan for young people. That's a collective impact project. So we do a lot of different things across different areas, and they're just sort of on the roll now. Do a lot of facilitation and community engagement work. One of the key features with strategic social marketing is really trying to get that citizen voice to inform policy and policy settings. So we've done quite a bit of work on that increasingly as well. And I think the trick there with us is that we don't try to overcomplicating it by sort of trying to interpret what we hear. we just go have conversations in communities and just reflect that back up in a sort of very honest and transparent way. And we've had some really good results from there, and sort of some very happy, fairly large government clients who are getting insights that, you know, that they have said to us they've not previously had. And really that's just been a function of actually going out and having those conversations.
So there is a definite advantage of you being an outside organization, so a separate one, not within the government. But do you see a future when governments should employ social marketeers, or is it happening already? Just I don't know about it.
Yeah, it does happen already. So I mean, social marketing, as I say, sort of manifests in lots of different ways around the world. But absolutely, there are social marketers embedded in certainly public health departments, increasingly in transport, in environment, and lots of different policy areas all over the place. So certainly in Australia, that's the case, certainly in New Zealand, a lot of Europe. As I was saying to you before the call, when I was at the National Social Marketing Centre, we were running workshops in the EU, and we had people from all over the European Union coming in, some from NGOs, some in international development, some at government. So they're everywhere. I find what I always say to people is that they tend to be the sorts that are just rolling up their sleeves and getting on with the job. They're not the ones that are making a lot of noise about what they're doing. So I think there's probably a few more out there than you think, and they're motivated to do good work. So they're out there because they want to have a positive impact in some way. You know, it's certainly why I set up the Behaviour Change Collaborative, and why all of the social marketers that I'm close with do what they do. So they sort of have that real pleasure of getting up in the morning and doing something positive with their skill sets. But yeah, most of them aren't feeling the need to trumpet what they do. They just get on and do it.
And you also mentioned that you are a generalist. What kind of advantages does it have? Because we all have this kind of pressure that we have to be experts in all the fields. And then a generalist view can also have its advantages. Because here, as you said, in social marketing, you have to deal with so many fields and so many approaches. It's such a big puzzle that you really do need a generalist view. But how do you work? Do you work with experts then, or how can you apply your knowledge to all these fields?
Yeah, I learned really quickly that the best way to sort of get successful outcomes is to surround myself with people that are a wee bit smarter than I am. So for me, I've been one of these guys that has my nose in books. I'm on continually learning, continually trying to see what other people are doing, and sort of trying to draw the best from lots and lots of different disciplines and bring that to a particular problem that sits in front of me. So the advantage is that when I go in and have a conversation with a prospective client, I'm able to fairly quickly ascertain what sort of expertise might be useful to bring to bear for that particular challenge, given the particular context. So that, but yeah, in terms of where it goes from there, I oftentimes will extricate myself completely, and I will bring in the relevant expertise. So we have a pretty large associate network, and that comprises any number of different disciplines, but mainly sort of research. I'm fairly okay on the Marcom side myself, but we do have a few there because, you know, in terms of work volumes, you need the support. We've got behavioural economists, we've got sociologists, psychologists, you know, any number of different. We've got behavioural designers, people that are experienced in facilitation and human-centred design. So it's really about just, yeah, we're a collaborative, it's hence the name. So it's understanding that every problem is different sorts of skill sets are going to be useful in different contexts. And for me, it's knowing just a little bit about each of those, but enough to recognise when it might add some value to a particular challenge. So yeah, that's certainly that's the main advantage. Yeah, so it has disadvantages as well, obviously. But yeah, I think for the role that I have and what I try to do, it works. We've also got links with universities and industry partners. So we are a small organisation, and the reason for that is that we've always tried to keep overheads down. We do a lot of our stuff remotely, and we've therefore able to deliver at a, you know, really, I think, cost competitive rate, some really good expertise, and we're profit for purpose. So we're not looking to make gazillions of dollars out of what we do. We're just looking to make enough to stay viable.
So this is a small organization with a huge network, and you just bring in experts that you feel fit for the project.
Yeah, we do. We've got a really extensive network. We've generated a lot of goodwill over a lot of years. And as I've said, the social marketing fraternity is global and tends to be quite generous with their time as well. So it's a really nice network to be part of. I also, yeah, sort of a lot of public health networks also, particularly. So, yeah, I think when you're doing things that make a difference, you tend to sort of build networks based on values. And I think then you're able to work with all sorts of really interesting people who, yeah, I certainly trust in terms of when we bring them on board to do a really good job. So really good skill sets, but doing things for the right reasons as well. I think it's important.
Wow, it's an impactful work with lots of fun and valuable people. It's a very, very good promotion for the profession.
I feel really privileged, very lucky to be able to do what I do. And it's not without its challenges, but it's certainly, you know, I enjoy getting up and sort of starting the day every day. I enjoy the work, which is...
That's already a big win, I think. Okay, so we promised some theory to the viewers, and we promised that we will show what kind of behavior framework you are using in your work. If you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I can. So have you got a copy of that you can stick up on the screen?
Yeah. Just a moment. Yes. So this umbrella PNG, that's what you said.
Right. Yeah. So again, what I would say, being a generalist, is I'm certainly not a behavioural theorist by any stretch of the imagination. But really what this is the Behaviour Change Collaborative's framework. Sorry, is that up on the screen now?
Not yet, but waiting for my computer to change its mind.
Fine. No worries. So it's basically, as I'm sure everyone can appreciate, there are lots and lots of different behavioural theories and models out there, some of which I know, many of which I don't. Thank you. But really what we've done, and what many other organisations like us do, is really try to put a framework together that draws on the best of those models and theories, and really talks to some of the, I guess, key features of a lot of those. And so this framework is really about a sort of, it's generic, and it's designed as a tool that really helps us understand what it is that is at play in terms of influencing a given individual's behaviour at any point in time. So it's a diagnostic tool, and you look to apply it something like a roadmap. You'll also see sort of in the outer ring, we're sort of talking about unconscious and conscious. So this is systems 1, systems 2 thinking, which is Daniel Kahneman's sort of thinking fast, thinking slow, which, you know, I can talk to an extent. But basically, you know, there we're talking about sort of habits and heuristics in terms of unconscious, and in the conscious, it's much more informed and rational decision making. And really, it's a case of, where we're concerned, trying to understand through the research and through our unpacking of any given problem, where decision making and choice is happening there. And then in terms of the umbrella itself, as I say, these are just some of the key things that we know can have an influence. So I probably can't dwell on all of those, but certainly for social marketing, so the cost benefit exchange is a big part of what we do, and really understanding the sort of what's in it for me question. And that will be different for different audiences. So in social marketing, segmentation is really important. We're not so keen on the sort of, we're targeting everybody with a particular message. We're targeting audiences within sort of different market segments, and then understanding for those what the cost benefit ratio looks like, and how we, I guess, increase benefits and reduce costs of people uptaking a given behaviour. So what this really talks to, I suppose, more than anything else, is the fact that we're sort of coming at these problems. Certainly a communications approach in and of itself isn't going to do the job, but also that we recognise that individuals do exercise choices within a context. So here, as I say, this is about us wanting to try and eliminate the different influences, For some people, there might be a self-efficacy issue. For some people, they might be more influenced by social norms. Others, we know that context and setting. So it's about not trying to fill every spot in this umbrella. It's about trying to understand for the particular audience that you're looking to segment, which of these is possibly most useful for us to leverage. And then down the bottom, what you have basically are intervention functions. And again, there are any number of models that talk to these, and you'll see communication is one of those. But also we're looking at things like control. So this is touching on sort of regulatory settings and legislative settings, through punitive measures, so on and so forth, that might come like speeding fines, this sort of stuff. Design and design features, so how we're presenting choices in different contexts. Certainly nudging sort of falls quite clearly into that particular space. Then incentivizing, enabling, and again, communicating. So yeah, really, it's just, as I say, a mechanism for us to diagnose different influences of behavior in an individual's world, and then look to develop intervention mixes accordingly. There are any number, as I say, of different behavioural theories that are used and applied. I'm not going to sit here and try to talk to those, because that is absolutely not an area of expertise of mine. But this is certainly, I think, a really useful tool, and it's designed for practitioners in that it is, I think, it takes the best of those models and theories and allows you to try and unpack different problems as you go.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible that you give us an example of one of your projects where you are kind of course, you are using this kind of framework, but like what kind of interventions, designs, incentives fit where? Just to put this into perspective and link it to practice.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think certainly in pretty much every program that we run, the cost benefit exchange is a key part of our thinking, simply because it is something that we can quite readily test when we're sort of going about our research. So the what's in it for me question, I think, is really, really important. Social license is interesting at the moment, and trust, I suppose, in the COVID context. And while we're not actually specifically doing anything in that space, it's certainly an area, I think, that is of particular relevance when you're looking at sort of a lot of the COVID comms and COVID responses around the world right now, and understanding where you are as a messenger, but whether if you're a government, where you sit there, how much trust there is both in your messaging, but also in vaccine and the vaccine efficacy. We're dealing in Australia at the moment with an increase in the amount of sort of vaccine hesitant people. And that's been a result largely of what's happened with AstraZeneca and the blood clotting, but also a function here of the context and setting that we're in, which is that we're relatively community spread free. So again, as someone who's looking to formulate a response, I'm looking at that and thinking, okay, so this is where we sit with social license and trust. But here in Western Australia, up until a week ago, we had no community spread for the last 12 months. So there is, from a context, that has a huge influence on how motivated we are to take a vaccine, because in this particular context and setting, we're not dealing with a huge amount of community-based COVID. So yeah, these sorts of things, and similarly the values. So what segment of the audience would be looking at it and looking at that sort of motivation of protecting others versus who do we need to target about protecting self. So it's not a specific example of a project, but it's about, okay, this is a particular issue that's current right now, and it just, you sort of work your way around and look to what this model can tell you about what you then need to do in terms of an intervention mix. And it will look different here in Australia on COVID than it would potentially in many parts of Europe.
For sure, yeah. Okay, and could you give us some examples of what kind of impact? We were talking about impact, that it's an impact-driven career. So what was your favorite project where you really had an impact and you like to talk about it?
I've had a lot of really interesting projects that I've been involved with. We did one fairly recently, well, in the last 3 or 4 years, locally here in family and domestic violence. And we do quite a bit in the family and domestic violence space. But this one was particularly good because it was an action research project. And it was funded by the Department of Social Services federally. And we worked in partnership with a local shelter, women's shelter. And we actually started off the project really wanting to increase help-seeking behaviours. So that was the brief. It's like, how can we encourage women to seek help when they're the victims of domestic abuse? Because we thought that was the problem. And it's a good example of what I was talking to earlier, of the value of then going and talking to community. So because it was an action research process, we had the opportunity to go and really test the assumptions that underpin the project from the outset. And so when we had those conversations and we talked particularly to Aboriginal elders and the Aboriginal community, we ran yarning sessions, but we didn't. We asked the community to run yarning sessions and we asked permission to observe. What we heard sort of categorically is we're not worried about help-seeking behaviours. We just need to stop the violence because there's far too much of it. And I think that was like what I liked about that was, you know, by being able to engage with community from the outset in a place-based setting, we were then able to completely change what it was we were looking to do from the project and then work with that community to develop a range of solutions. And I wouldn't suggest for a second that we've solved the problem where that project rolled out, but I think it was particularly satisfying and enjoyable because we were given the flexibility to change and adapt as we went based on what we heard from the community we were serving. And that's not something that you get the opportunity to do a lot. And there is still, you know, that project is now wrapped up, but there is still a strategic advisory group. We brought together a range of other organisations that previously weren't linked up, and they're all now linked and operating. So it's sustainable in terms of the outcome as well, in terms of having a much more robust and cohesive approach to addressing violence as and when it happens and to prevention. So it wasn't perfect, and there's a lot of things that we'd learned from it as well. But I think it was one of my favourites because it did allow us that flexibility where most projects that we get involved with, as much as we would like to, it's really difficult to get organisations to cede control to community and because they will have pretty set views about what it is that they're looking to get out of a particular project. You know, and whether that's an NGO or whether that's government and a minister has a particular objective, you kind of you're not hand-tied. There is room to move, but it's very rare that you get the level of community engagement that one had. And then just briefly, I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, I had a really interesting session with a bunch of 12 to 17-year-old youth talking about alcohol and, you know, what was going on in their lives. And we haven't got the outcomes from that project yet. We're still involved in it, but I still enjoy it. And that's the part of social marketing that I do still enjoy, is rolling up the sleeves rather than sitting behind the desk and actually getting out and talking to people about what's going on and what we can do to help solve it and what they can do and what they would like to do to help solve it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much. I was looking at the chat and we have some questions. Maya, I give the floor to you because you have a complicated one.
Oh dear.
That needs a bit
Hello.
of an explanation.
It's been a pleasure. Hello, it's been a pleasure to listen to you. Well, I have two technical questions if they're not too if they're not too
the rolling up the sleeve part.
I was just wondering because I was recently I was using this framework which is based on when you do the strategy on the social ecological model for change. Do you know which one it is? It's also used by United Nations, etc., etc. And actually, it's this one. Thanks, Beeke, for sharing the screen. And no, I just wanted to ask you if you use it and if you have any experience. If not, then never mind the question.
Yeah, look, I don't use it personally because I just don't profess to be an expert in the application of behavioural theory, but we have others that would use it as part of the approach. So one of the things in social marketing, one of the key criteria is a theoretical underpinning to any campaign that we look to do. Any program, so it doesn't have to be a campaign. I use that framework that I was talking to previously and frameworks like it. So Susan Mitchie's combi, like behaviour change wheel, you might have seen, that's a really good one as well. But that's because it's good for me because they're a bit dumbed down, if I'm quite honest. So I don't have the expertise to really know categorically what's the best theory. So I rely on other people to do that. But I use those sort of more diagnostic, pragmatic tools as a practitioner to just get a good idea of what's needed. And then if I need the expertise around that area, and we'll work with, as I say, universities and such who do have that expertise. And if those models are needed, then yes, we would look to do so. But to be quite honest, we are fairly pragmatic in terms of the approaches that we take. So there's an awareness of a lot of the models, but we wouldn't necessarily say, right, this is the model that we're going to apply. The other thing that I would say is that a lot of the models that I had seen, so stages of change and some of these others that are fairly commonly used in communications campaigns, what I will often reflect when looking at those is that they were written at a time when trust was at a different place and when society was in a different spot. So I still think that there is absolutely a use for it, but I think it tends to be, there's a couple of models that tend to be the default. And I'm not so sure that we always do the sort of forensics that are needed to identify what's actually the best model. And certainly my observation would be, as I say, certainly with the trans-theoretical model, written, I'm going to say 60s or 70s, it might be a bit later than that, but it was certainly at a time that, there was that trust there, and we could quite reliably sort of convey information, and people would tend to trust a lot more what was said. People are thinking for themselves a lot more now. And I think that there is just a range of other ways that we need to come at it. But as I say, for me, I don't want to get too much into sort of the behavioural theory side because it really isn't a strong point of mine. We have, as I say, sort of academic partners, and I've got associates and stuff that we would bring in. For me, that framework's about as switched on as I get in that particular area, and then I handball it to someone a bit smarter.
Wow, I love your approach so much, Maya. I mean, this is kind of a refreshing thing to say. I'm not an expert. This is academic stuff. Let's roll up our sleeves and put things into practice. I mean, you are certainly my guy, and this profession is certainly my profession. I really love it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I had to get comfortable with really early when I started the Behaviour Change Collaborative was going into clients who obviously expect you to have an answer to their problem, and getting comfortable with the fact that actually you can't, when it comes to behaviour, you cannot be an expert at it. It's just not possible. But what I will always say is that the people who you're trying to influence are an expert in the behaviour that we're talking to. So I've learned over the years to get comfortable about where my strengths are, where I don't have expertise, be quite honest about that. And even when talking to clients, I'm quite happy to say, look, I don't know. I think that that's a far better way to go at it. And then you go from there and say, well, either A, your target audience probably knows better than any of us, and or B, I know somebody else who does, and we'll get them in the room. And that's why I've set up a collaborative, because I think anybody who's out there who's professing sort of expertise in behaviour change and then feels like they can tick all of those boxes off, I think is really probably not being entirely honest with themselves.
Thank you. The next question comes from Eric. Eric, do you want to speak up? If not, then your question was, is formative research the key to know which piece of the umbrella we should use?
Okay, it would certainly help, yes. So I think the umbrella is useful before you start the research, because it can also help you to sort of get an understanding of what sort of formative research might be most useful. But then, yes, it's also, once you've got past that stage, absolutely can use to inform the research proper. So yes to all of those. It's something it's something that can be used at any stage of the process, because you always, particularly in programs that are happening over a period of time, looking to come back and test, because things move as the project evolves. And so I think that's an important part of the evaluation when you're putting together, a good evaluation plan as part of any social marketing intervention. You sort of come back to this and just check where you are, where you in terms of where you've got to, and what adjustments you need to make based on where you now find yourself. And again, coming back to the COVID example, that's been a moving feast. So yes, it would absolutely be useful at that formative research stage, but it's equally useful mid-project, because the context and setting has changed so much, and all of a sudden we've got a vaccine. So the constant change in the broader environment means that you need to keep coming back to it and keep testing it throughout the life of the project.
Mm-hmm. And the COVID is also such a great example that what would work in Australia maybe would never work in Hungary, because it's a completely different context, completely different setting, and everyone should do their homeworks with the project they are working on. So theoretical research or research from another countries might not be so relevant.
No, and that's like, again, from a social marketing standpoint, like when you look at international marketing and what you do there in terms of segment, I mean, people know that different countries have different, so Australians are fairly compliant in relative terms. So there were a number of reasons why, but I mean, we had really high rates of compliance in terms of staying home, in terms of mask wearing, and a lot of these others. Whereas other countries might, where civil liberties are more, well, it's not that they're more important, but they're more celebrated, I suppose. They will flout those sorts of things. Whereas, so again, it's different. Each country, culture, religious, like every target audience has different drivers of behaviour, different motivators that you need to consider when putting together an intervention. So there's no such thing as one size fits all. But what there is a fairly well evidenced approach to designing and implementing and evaluating behaviour change programs. And I think that's where social marketing is useful, because it is, there are established benchmarks, there are established criteria. As I was saying to you before the meeting, in the UK, they've got national occupational standards, there are planning processes, and all of these are tried and tested and can be applied to pretty much any behavioural challenge you can think of. So you don't need to be an expert in the subject matter itself. I don't need to be an expert in COVID to be able to look at it from a behavioural standpoint and say, well, these are some of the things that might be useful in terms of communicating that more effectively.
Mm-hmm. So the process is the same, the steps are the same, but you have to fill it with local context and
different operators will emphasize different elements of that planning process, and but in broad terms, the way, and in terms of those key principles, there's an International Social Marketing Association. They've got a fairly well established, they've got a clear definition, and there are clear things that social marketing practitioners globally would be looking to tick off when they're putting together an intervention. So yeah, people will, as I say, potentially place more or less emphasis on different aspects of that, but certainly it's a fairly well established field of practice. And yeah, you can bring that tool set, and it's a very multidisciplinary tool set to most, if not all, behavioural challenges I think of.
And back to the impact part, Maya also asked, could you please tell us how do you measure the impact of your campaigns? How do you set criteria?
Yeah, okay. We don't do as much. So in terms of campaigns, we don't do a lot of work in the campaigns side of things at the Behaviour Change Collaborative. So we're more involved at the front end in terms of putting, sort of supporting the formative behavioural research and then advising on what comes next. So and to be quite honest with you, it is quite challenging to measure behavioural impacts of campaigns. So what I've seen typically in most of the sort of campaign evaluations is that you will look at reach, and you're looking at awareness and recall and some of those sort of measures. But it's really challenging to sort of flesh out where the campaigns had an impact versus some of those other intervention functions, because it's difficult to separate. And for that reason, I think, based on what I've seen elsewhere, there's not a lot of really strong sort of behavioural evaluation of campaigns. And I put my hand up to say that we don't do that either. But that being said, we don't roll out campaigns. So that's, you know, something that others are doing. We would advise and endeavour to suggest ways that you might be able to do things. But to be quite honest, it's very challenging. The practicalities of doing it are very, it's very difficult to, as I say, isolate the impact of a given message on a behaviour, like, you know, whether it's road safety or smoking, because there's just so many other contributing factors. So I know it's possibly not a particularly helpful answer, but that is what I've observed based on what I've seen others do.
Yeah, it's about how to sell your services to clients if they don't really, if they are not really aware of this approach. it can be tricky.
I mean, no, and as I say, it's because with the social marketing that I do tends not to be that heavily campaign focused anyway. So the social marketing that we're doing, we're looking at sort of measurable and observable behaviours, and often social marketing programs that I would be involved in are place-based, so you can do that. You know, and it might just be pre and post surveys around sort of behaviour. So if it's recycling, for example, and so yes, there's self-reporting biases potentially, but we're not in the game of executing campaigns like mass communications campaigns. It's not really what we do. We look at, okay, what's the behaviour, and where we tend to come in is helping organisations develop strategy and approaches to how to unpack that. And oftentimes, a lot of the really good social marketing campaigns, well, not campaigns, interventions and programs that I have seen and or been involved with haven't actually had really too much by way of communications at all, because it's a design solution, you know, or it's a policy or regulatory or a combination of both. So it's different. It's not something that we do a lot of. It's what is the most visible aspect of the big budget social marketing stuff. But a lot of social marketing isn't big budget. A lot of big social marketing is really more along the lines of sort of old school community development and capacity building, and really understanding what's going on and then working with communities to co-design solutions. So there is no campaign to evaluate. What you evaluate is, has there been a change on the ground, and that's observable.
Okay. And one last question from Martin. Martin, if you want to ask, then just unmute yourself, but I can, yeah. Martin.
Yeah, hi. Very interesting talk. I wanted to ask, because, nice to meet you. Like, because I have a background in public policy, I was just wondering, one of the things that we learned there was like the carrot, the stick, and the sermon as the main ways to influence people. But from a policy perspective. So I was just wondering, like, from your perspective, do you think policy nudging is more effective, or do you do that more? Or do you appeal to citizens and consumers directly? Because I'm not a social marketing expert in any way. So I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly in the strategic social marketing space, there is a lot of value, I think, in citizen-informed policy. So that's where we're actually going. So as an example, we did a piece of work for the health department here in Western Australia, and they were looking at their service provision of so ambulance service provision across the state, and they were looking at what that procurement policy should look like. And so rather than the policymakers and advisors sort of formulating that, we got a fairly open brief to go out and have conversations with people who had used those services, to better understand how those services could be made better through a policy lens. And then that was used to inform what then became a statewide ambulance service policy. So I don't know that there is necessarily a sort of clear-cut answer, because again, it comes back to that diagnostic tool that I was talking to previously. It's going to entirely depend on the behaviour and on the context and settings within which that behaviour takes place as to whether a policy approach is going to be effective, ineffective, or actually counterproductive entirely. So certainly I was talking about smoking earlier, and I mean, in that context, as much as I said, we did some really good advertising, what's actually, I think, had the most effect has been policy change in terms of pricing policy, hence the push in public health towards sort of minimum alcohol pricing and these sort of things as well. But also in terms of availability and access, those sorts of mechanisms. In other contexts, policy is probably not going to have too much impact. So there's no hard and fast answer. I don't think it's really about what is the behavioural. It's just what's the behavioural challenge, and what are the different features of that as defined by those that we're looking to influence. And then better understanding using a framework such as ours. There are plenty of other good ones out there as well, I might add. What is the best intervention mix? And normally it is a mix. Normally it isn't just comms, or it's not just policy, or it's not just design. It's a mix of things. And it's just being a bit sophisticated and clever about what that looks like. And again, the marketing bit is the segmentation. It's the piece that I think, you know, certainly in social marketing, we're constantly emphasizing is that policy change might affect and work really well for certain segments of an audience, but not for other segments of the audience. And so it's about, you know, even at sort of, I guess, government level, I don't know what it's like there in terms of we have local, state and federal governance here. So I don't know how many different sort of levels of government or tiers of government you have, but being really clear about who does what where, and whether or not, you know, you're looking at policy for this particular segment, but then for these segments, actually it's more of a design function, or here we just need to communicate it because they're not aware of it. It really very much depends on each individual case and each individual audience.
Thank you very much. And my last question is, because I see no other questions and I put some useful links in the chat. So my last question is, if anyone got to like this process based on this, what we were talking here today, a municipality, for example, and they really like this, but they don't know any social marketeers, what would your advice be towards them? Like, how should they start experimenting with this approach?
Okay, I would say in Europe, European Social Marketing Association is a really good place to start. They have been operating now for just about 10 years. It's a really strong community of practice in the social marketing space, with a whole bunch of really, really experienced, highly credentialed social marketers that have worked everything from sort of downstream individual community-based stuff right the way up to sort of advising sort of UN and WHO on upstream policy stuff. So that's a really good place I would suggest to start. I would tap into the International Social Marketing Association as well. There's a lot of webinars and a lot, again, a really strong community of practice. People should absolutely feel free to contact me at any time. And I'm sure Victoria will pass on my details. So I've got a lot of network around the place. The UK, the National Social Marketing Centre, in conjunction with the Chartered Institute of Marketing, I think it is there, established national occupational standards, which are readily applicable to really any other jurisdiction out there. So again, that would be a good place to start. And just get along. As I say, the European Association does have a biannual conference. The World Social Marketing Conference happens every 2 years as well. So those sorts of things are worth getting along to. But in the first instance, yeah, definitely start with the European Social Marketing Association, and I'm sure that there will be people there more than willing to help.
Thank you very much, and really thank you for being here today. And we will keep in touch, and I already put your contacts in the chat. So let's follow each other on Twitter, find us on Facebook, and continue this conversation. Thank you very much, Luke.
No worries at all.
Pleasure.
Cheers. Bye.